Hi, welcome back to the channel. My name is Jay, and I'm a historian who obviously loves talking about the past. And if you haven't been following the last few weeks, this is actually part 6 of a 9-part series in which I read out my thesis, the Submarine and Maritime Strategy, to you, and I give you an update on where my research is. So this week we're going to go through Chapter 5, the U.S. Navy. Quote, Admiral Dewey, one of the few naval officers who have had experience of the difficulties of blockading a steam squadron in its own harbor, has definitely stated that if the Spanish had had 2 submarine boats, he could not have held his ships off Manila. End quote. Archibald S. Hurt. Naval Efficiency, the War Readiness of the Fleet. The United States at the turn of the century was viewed as an emerging naval power on the world's oceans. The decisive fleet victories over the Spanish at Manila and Santiago during the Spanish-American War gave notice to the rest of the world that the U.S. Navy was no longer the small backwater force that it had been for the first century of its existence. Much of the credit for this development lies with the influence of the officers of the U.S. Navy itself, along with a handful of key supporters, who were able to bring the issues of the post-Civil War fleet to light and propose solutions to remedy those problems. Beginning with the founding of the Naval Institute in Annapolis, these career naval officers began to discuss strategies, ideas, and issues that affected their profession in the journal Proceedings. Part of the success of Proceedings was that it allowed junior officers to propose their thoughts on naval affairs outside of the chain of command without the fear of facing disciplinary action. As a result, senior officers appreciated the ideas that were proposed and would incorporate some of the best ideas into naval policies and procedures and practices. One of those ideas that turned into policy was the formation of the Naval War College in Newport, Rhode Island, under the direction of Stephen B. Luce in 1884. To provide the historical lectures, Luce asked his friend Alfred Thayer Mahan to join the faculty. After spending a short furlough studying naval history and developing his teaching plans, Mahan began educating naval officers on the lessons that could be found in the historical record. These lectures were very popular with the students of the Naval War College, and Mahan was given numerous opportunities to give presentations on naval history. As a result, Mahan compiled his lectures, along with a chapter discussing the need for a strong navy, into The Influence of Sea Power Upon History, 1660 to 1783. Mahan and Roosevelt's Influence. Mahan's The Influence of Sea Power had a more immediate and direct effect on naval policy in the United States than in Europe. By 1890, Mahan had become acquainted with the majority of the principal navalist and maritime thinkers in America through his connection with Luce and the Naval War College. Mahan had begun key relationships with Henry Cabot Lodge and Theodore Roosevelt, who would direct the legislative and later the executive efforts to modernize the U.S. Navy. The election of William McKinley to the presidency in 1896 found Roosevelt in the key position of Assistant Secretary of the Navy, where he would have a direct hand in shaping naval policies. Mahan retired from the Navy in 1895 and dedicated himself to commenting on naval affairs. 1897 saw the release of The Interests of America in Sea Power, Present and Future, a compilation of articles that had been previously published. These articles advocated for an expanded role for the U.S. Navy, especially in the Caribbean and Gulf of Mexico, and across the vast expanses of the Pacific. Needless to say, Roosevelt was in agreement with these assessments, as he would actively pursue most, if not all, of Mahan's recommendations as Assistant Secretary of the Navy and later as President. Since their introduction during the 1880s, Mahan and Roosevelt maintained an exchange of letters regarding naval policy between them. Both men would propose ideas for the other's comment or advocate for a particular policy or design. By no means was it an exchange of letters between a student and his master, but rather it was an ongoing discussion of naval affairs between two contemporaries which would have long-term effects on the U.S. Navy. Like in any relationship, there were disagreements between Mahan and Roosevelt, but not to the extent that it threatened to dissolve their relationship. The American efforts to build the Panama Canal provides an example of the extent of Mahan and Roosevelt's influence over maritime matters during the early years of the 20th century. Mahan had advocated for the canal since 1890, observing that if it was under the control of a hostile European nation, such as Germany, the west coast would be threatened by an enemy fleet. Roosevelt also recognized the military potential that America and control over in Isthmian Canal presented. A canal in Panama would greatly shorten the trip between the American coasts and allow for the U.S. Navy to move ships from one ocean to the other quickly, therefore reducing the size of the fleet that was needed. After the Panama Canal was completed, American naval plans made allowances for moving the bulk of the battle fleet between the Pacific and Atlantic as the threat to the security of the United States shifted over the years. The need for a modern navy. With the closing of the West, the rapid expansion of industry that began during the Civil War, and the continued prominence of the cotton trade, the United States was relying on maritime shipping to expand its trading base globally. Unlike the colonial powers of Europe, the United States had not developed a colonial empire. Rather, it had spent the 19th century focused on developing the interior of its vast continental territory. Due to that internal focus, the need for a navy was minimal, just large enough to protect its coast from invasion, patrol the sea lanes, and show the flag in foreign ports of call. For the majority of the first century of the U.S. Navy's existence, a modern fleet of frigates, steamers, and smaller ships had been sufficient. By the end of the 19th century, the United States had begun to rely on foreign trade to booster its economy. It was in this environment of increased trade that Mahan argued that the time had arrived for building a modern navy to defend the sea lanes. The central argument presented in The Influence of Sea Power was that the United States needed to expand its navy not only to protect its coast from an invasion, but also to protect its global trading interests. While he derived his lessons from the experiences of Great Britain and France with their colonial empires, Mahan argued that the principles applied to a post-colonial economic industrial nation such as the United States. American maritime trade sailed out ports on both the Atlantic and Pacific coasts, which necessitated the need for a fleet with enough ships to protect that shipping. Furthermore, the lengthy coastlines of the United States, along with the vast oceans, had served as a natural moat in protecting the fledgling nation from the threat of a major European invasion. The development of newer steam-powered ships with longer range was threatening this natural protective barrier, therefore necessitating the need for a larger navy. Additionally, there was not an efficient method of moving ships between the Atlantic and the Pacific. At the end of the 19th century, ships sailing from New York had to sail around the entirety of South America to reach San Francisco. This factor would require that the United States either build a fleet as large as the Royal Navy to adequately protect both coasts, or construct a canal in Latin America that would cut the transit time between the two oceans by months. Navalists such as Roosevelt and Lodge would use the Monroe Doctrine to justify the need to expand the Navy and pursue a canal between the two nations. Introduced in 1823 by President James Monroe, this doctrine declared that the United States alone had the right to intervene in the affairs of nations in the Western Hemisphere, not the European powers. Yet, because the internal focus of American policy for the majority of the 19th century, the Monroe Doctrine was rarely invoked. The closing of the West and the increased American shipping trade at the end of the 19th century, along with the acquisition of Puerto Rico after the Spanish-American War, saw the United States increasing its influence in Latin America. One of the principal goals of American intervention into the Caribbean was to minimize the European presence and influence in that region. Great Britain, Germany, the Netherlands, and France still possessed numerous island territories on which there were a few naval stations. The navalists in the United States saw this both as a threat to the homeland and a violation of the Monroe Doctrine. In their minds, having a large modern fleet would force the European powers to downsize their Caribbean commitments and recognize American prominence in the region. The greatest threat to American interests in the Caribbean, according to the Roosevelt administration, was Imperial Germany. Roosevelt harbored nightmarish thoughts about German intentions and capabilities in the Caribbean. These fears were reasonable. Not only was Germany expanding its fleet, but also viewed the United States as an obstacle in any attempt to colonize South America. Furthermore, Kaiser Wilhelm II refused to recognize American prominence in Latin American affairs as established by the Monroe Doctrine. Between the imperialist desires of Germany and the declared goal of the United States to acquire the second greatest navy, plans began to be made for a future fleet action against the High Seas Fleet. It was also during this era that the United States adopted the open door policy in regards to China. The United States called for fair and open trade between all nations in China and would need to maintain a naval presence in the Western Pacific to enforce this policy. Additionally, the United States had acquired the Philippines and Guam from Spain at the conclusion of the Spanish-American War and annexed the Hawaiian Islands in 1898, therefore requiring an expanded Pacific fleet to protect these new assets. Writing in 1914 as a young Assistant Secretary of the Navy, Franklin D. Roosevelt reported on the vast deployments of American warships on a day in February of that year. The far-flung fleet, quote, shows that in times of peace it is an organization very much occupied with many different kinds of work in many different places. That it is keeping the peace, preventing bloodshed and disorder, governing islands, carrying on scientific work for the benefit of commerce, seeking to rescue castaways, and doing 100 unsung deeds that make it an American institution to be proud of, end quote. Included in these deployments were submarines, as far removed as Manila and closer to home in California, Washington State, New York, and South Carolina. It was the need to enforce American foreign policy abroad that led the U.S. Navy to adopt the submarine at the end of the 19th century. Naval planners intended to use the submarine as a coastal defense platform, thus allowing the main battle fleet to be free to pursue any enemy forces and allow cruisers to continue patrolling the sea lanes. As the range of the submarine increased and wireless telegraphy was becoming reliable, the U.S. Navy would add scouting duties to this vessel. With their small silhouette on the surface and the ability to merge quickly, the submarine was a stealthy vessel that could scout for an enemy fleet and report it back without being detected. Avenues for future research. Like with the Imperial German Navy, further research is needed to fill the historiographical gaps that exist in regards to the U.S. Navy and their efforts to adopt the submarine into their strategic plans. Of particular interest to any future study should be the minutes and notes of the Navy's General Board, which was created after the Spanish-American War to advise the Secretary of the Navy on maritime strategy. With the threat that an expanding German colonial empire would have presented to the American enforcement of the Monroe Doctrine, along with Great Britain ceding maritime control of the Caribbean and Western Atlantic to the United States, how the submarine factored into naval strategy during this era presents fertile ground for new studies. And that was Chapter 5 of my master's thesis. I hope you enjoyed it and learned something. Please like, subscribe, and share this with anyone you think is interesting. If you're going to comment, please be kind to everyone, and I will see you next week for the next chapter. Bye-bye.